D.C., the final speech of Steve Rogers. The sky over Washington was clear and bright, the kind of blue that made you forget, for a brief moment, that the world was on the brink of tearing itself apart. The crowd stretched for blocks, thousands gathering in the heart of the National Mall, pressed together like waves against the grand stage erected before the Capitol. They had come to hear a hero speak. They had come to hear Captain America. Steve Rogers stood at the podium, dressed in a crisp navy blue suit, no shield at his side, no battle-worn armor on his shoulders. This wasn't a war, not yet, but the fight was coming. His hands gripped the edges of the podium, steady but firm, and his voice carried over the restless crowd. Every camera was on him. The world was listening. When I put on the uniform, when I carried the shield, I did so because I believed in what this country stood for, Steve began. His blue eyes scanned the thousands before him, not just in Washington, but beyond, millions watching live across the globe. But today I see a government more interested in control than freedom. A world divided not by ideals, but by fear. The Sokovia Accords were meant to protect us, but instead, they threaten the very foundation of what we fight for. The crowd murmured, shifting uneasily. This was not the speech they had expected. In the front row, Sam Wilson stood with Natasha Romanoff, arms crossed. They knew what was coming. They had helped write it. A few feet away, Tony Stark watched from a private section, sunglasses hiding his expression. And in the crowd, standing quietly in the back, Bucky Barnes lowered his head, pulling his cap lower over his face. He wasn't supposed to be here, but he needed to hear this. Steve exhaled slowly, then continued. Which is why I can't stand by any longer. We have to stop this, not through war, not through violence, but by making our voices heard, by standing for what's right. He took a deep breath. That is why, today, I am announcing my candidacy for President of the United States. The crowd erupted, gasps, shouts, applause. Even Tony Stark, sitting behind tinted glasses, muttered, "Well, that's one hell of a curveball." Bucky's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't known. Steve hadn't told him. He hadn't told anyone. Steve raised his hands for silence, waiting for the roaring excitement to settle. We need leadership that understands what it means to fight for freedom, not just with words, but with actions. Leadership that answers to the people, not to fear. I am not a politician. I am not perfect. But I believe in this country. I believe in its people. And I refuse to let fear control us any longer. More applause. More cheers. And then, crack. The sound echoed like thunder. Steve Rogers jerked violently. For a moment, it wasn't real. Then, the blood came. It sprayed across the podium, deep red, against the white marble of the stage. His hands flew to his neck, but there was nothing to stop the bleeding. People screamed. Chaos erupted. Steve collapsed. Bucky saw it in slow motion. The way Steve's legs gave out. The way his body hit the ground. How his fingers twitched as if trying to hold on. Sam was the first to reach him, tearing off his jacket, pressing it against the wound, but the blood just kept coming. "Stay with me, Steve," Sam shouted. "Medic, get a medic." Natasha was already moving, scanning the rooftops, looking for the shooter. Tony was frozen, and Bucky was running. His feet hit the pavement before he even realized it. He shoved past the panicking crowd, shouldering people out of the way. He had to get to Steve. He stopped. He could see Steve now, lying on his back, eyes blinking rapidly, struggling for breath. Steve turned his head slightly. Their eyes met. Bucky saw the recognition, the realization that this was the end. Steve's lips moved. No words came out, just blood. Bucky dropped to his knees beside him, grabbing his hand. "Don't do this, stay with me." Steve tried to squeeze his fingers, but he had no strength left. His breathing slowed, and then, nothing. Captain America was dead. The chaos didn't stop. The crowd scattered in blind terror, the streets filled with the sounds of sirens, shouting, and confusion. No one could process what had just happened. The headlines hit immediately. Captain America assassinated in Washington. Who killed Steve Rogers? But before the world could find an answer, something worse happened. The news reported the first suspect. Stark tech was found in the sniper's weapon. And suddenly, Tony Stark was no longer just a hero. He was a suspect. 2 days later, Steve's body lay on a cold metal table in an undisclosed location, his shield resting beside him. Bucky stood over him, his fingers gripping Steve's lifeless hand. His metal arm trembled. "You were supposed to outlive me, punk," Bucky whispered. The world wanted answers, the world wanted justice. But Bucky didn't care about the world, he only cared about one thing. "Whoever did this," he muttered, eyes burning with grief. "I'm going to find them, and I'm going to bury them." His gaze fell on Steve's shield. He reached out, lifting it for the first time. The reflection staring back at him wasn't Steve Rogers. It was something darker. 2 weeks after Steve Rogers' assassination, the world in chaos. The world had changed. Steve Rogers' death fractured everything. The Sokovia Accords debate had been put on hold, but it no longer mattered. Trust between governments had crumbled. The United States, shaken by the assassination of Captain America, had entered a state of paranoia, with intelligence agencies scrambling to identify the killer. But no one had answers. The sniper had disappeared, his rifle, an advanced prototype outfitted with Stark tech components, left behind on the rooftop as a ghostly reminder of the shot that ended an era. The headlines never stopped. Tony Stark linked to Captain America's assassination. America loses its hero, who will rise? Is the Winter Soldier responsible? Bucky barely heard them anymore. He had spent the last 14 days in silence, buried in grief, hidden in a safe house outside of Washington. He hadn't spoken a word, hadn't slept. He had barely eaten, just staring at the shield propped up against the wall, his mind running in endless, angry circles. The funeral had been private, too dangerous to hold publicly. Sam Wilson had given the eulogy, his voice strong but broken, while Natasha Romanoff and Clint Barton had stood silent in the back. T'Challa had been there too, offering quiet respect, but Bucky had refused to go. He couldn't see Steve like that, buried under a flag. Steve Rogers wasn't supposed to die like this, not by a sniper's bullet, not without a fight. He should have gone out on his feet, and that thought, the injustice of it, was what burned in Bucky's chest now. Because someone had done this. Someone had stolen Steve's life. And while the rest of the world was looking for answers, Bucky Barnes was going to find the truth. And he was going to kill the man responsible. The cold wind cut through the darkened streets of Bucharest. Bucky moved like a ghost, slipping through alleyways, his movements precise, methodical. He had contacts from his days as the Winter Soldier, ghosts hidden in the criminal underworld, men who owed him debts they couldn't repay. Tonight, he was calling one in. Inside a dingy bar, an informant named Radu sat alone, hunched over a glass of whiskey. His hand shook as he lifted it to his lips, knowing who was waiting for him in the shadows. Bucky stepped forward, the hood of his jacket pulled low, the dim light glinting off his vibranium arm. No words needed to be spoken. Radu already knew why he was here. "You want the sniper?" Radu rasped, eyes darting around the room checking for exits. He wouldn't find any. Bucky didn't move, didn't blink. Who hired him? Radu swallowed hard. He looked at the glass in his hands, as if it could offer protection. Then, finally, he sighed. "There's a name. whispers in the underworld, an old ghost, someone who was supposed to be dead. Bucky's fist clenched. Who? Radu exhaled, voice barely above a whisper. Brock Rumlow. The name sent a shockwave through Bucky's chest. He knew that name, Crossbones. He had watched Rumlow die in Lagos, burned alive in an explosion. But now, the man who had supposedly died by his own suicide bomb had somehow orchestrated the assassination of Captain America. Bucky stepped closer. Where is he? Radu shook his head. No one knows, but he's back, Barnes, and he's not working alone. Bucky didn't wait for more. He turned, leaving Radu with his fear. If Crossbones was alive, if that son of a bitch had killed Steve, Bucky was going to find him, and this time, he was going to make sure Brock Rumlow stayed dead. While Bucky was hunting Crossbones, Tony Stark was hunting him. Tony had spent weeks in the lab, obsessing over every detail of the sniper's weapon. Every forensic team, every intelligence analyst had come back with the same answer. Stark tech had been used in the rifle's construction, but he knew he hadn't built that weapon. He knew he hadn't pulled the trigger, and yet the world wasn't interested in what he knew. The world wanted someone to blame, and if it wasn't him, it was the Winter Soldier. Every lead pointed back to Bucky. The sniper rifle had been modified with Hydra-grade stealth components, the type of weaponry used in assassinations performed by the Winter Soldier decades ago. The public was already forming their own conclusions. Captain America's greatest enemy, the ghost of the Cold War, the killer who never stopped killing. The government wanted Bucky Barnes dead, and Tony wasn't sure if he disagreed. He had tried to do better. He had tried to listen to Steve, to take his advice, to not let his anger consume him. But Steve was gone, and all Tony had left was the truth he could see with his own eyes. Bucky Barnes had been in Washington. He had disappeared the moment Steve was shot, and now he was running. Tony took that as all the proof he needed. He was going to find the Winter Soldier, and this time, he wasn't going to let Steve Rogers stop him. The abandoned Hydra base in Siberia was supposed to be empty. It wasn't. Bucky moved silently through the ruins, the cold biting into his skin. He was dressed in black tactical armor. The fabric reinforced, the colors faded, but on his left shoulder, barely visible in the moonlight, was a silver star. This wasn't the suit of Captain America. This was something darker. As he moved through the corridors, he found stacks of crates, heavy weaponry, explosives, old Hydra tech. The base wasn't just occupied, it was operational. And then, he heard the voice. "Never thought I'd see you again, Barnes." Bucky turned sharply, his breath freezing in his chest. Crossbones stepped out of the shadows, his body covered in black and red armor, reinforced with cybernetic plating. His face was half burned, scarred from the explosion in Lagos, but his eyes were sharp, filled with hate. "You came a long way to die." Bucky's jaw clenched. "You killed Steve." Crossbones smirked. "Yeah." Bucky moved first. The fight was violent, savage, personal. Crossbones fought like a mercenary, striking with brute force, his cybernetic enhancements making him faster, stronger. But Bucky was relentless, fueled by rage, by grief, by the need to make this man pay. Blow after blow, they tore through the ruins, metal clashing, bones breaking. Crossbones taunted him, laughed through the blood. "You really think this ends with me?" Rumlow sneered. "You have no idea what's coming." Bucky ignored him. With one final strike, he sent Crossbones crashing through a wall, bloodied and broken. He raised his weapon. This was it. The man who killed Steve Rogers was on his knees. All he had to do was pull the trigger. But then, gunfire erupted outside. Bucky turned. The Siberian super soldiers were waking up, and the only one standing between them and total war was Iron Man. Snow fell in thick, heavy waves, carried by the howling winds of the Siberian wasteland. The cold bit at exposed skin, but the fire of battle burned hotter. Inside the ruined Hydra facility, 3 wars raged at once. Bucky Barnes stood over a broken Brock Rumlow, Crossbones. His enemy lay in the wreckage, armor cracked, blood spilling from his mouth as he laughed, a deep, raspy sound that echoed through the empty corridors. Iron Man was outside alone, fighting the newly awakened Winter Soldiers. These weren't ordinary men, they were killers, ghosts of the past, each trained to wage war without conscience, without hesitation. And somewhere in the chaos, Black Panther had caught up to Helmut Zemo. But Bucky wasn't thinking about any of that. His breathing was ragged, his heart hammering against his ribs. His gun was aimed directly at Rumlow's head. Crossbones smirked through the blood on his lips. Do it. Bucky's grip on the gun tightened. You killed him. The words were barely above a whisper, but they cut like steel. Crossbones grinned wider. Yeah, and guess what, Barnes? It was easy. Bucky's world blurred in red. His finger moved on the trigger. Bucky. The voice was inside his head. No, not inside, it was Steve's voice. You're more than what they made you. Bucky's breath caught. His hands trembled. He could still feel Steve's grip on his shoulder. Hear the words Steve had once told him. You get to choose who you are. Crossbones' smirk faded just slightly when he saw the hesitation in Bucky's eyes. Go ahead, he sneered, trying to keep control. Do what you were trained to do. You think wearing the shield changes what you are. You're still just a weapon. You're still a killer. Bucky closed his eyes. He had spent his whole life being told who he was. A soldier, a tool, a weapon. He had been shaped by war, by blood, by suffering. But Steve had seen something else. Steve had seen a man. No. Bucky exhaled. His voice steady now. He lowered the gun. Not anymore. Crossbones' expression flickered. Shock. Disbelief. Bucky had made his choice. He wasn't going to kill out of revenge, because that wasn't who Steve was. Because that wasn't who he wanted to be. With a swift, precise strike, Bucky knocked Crossbones unconscious instead. The war wasn't going to end with another corpse, but outside, another war still raged, and Bucky had one last fight left to finish. Tony Stark was losing. His repulsors burned red hot, smoke trailing from his damaged armor. The Siberian Winter Soldiers were stronger than he expected. They moved with precision, skill, absolute brutality. His HUD flickered, alerts flashing, power at 23%, structural damage critical, right thruster offline. He fired another repulsor blast, hitting one of the soldiers' center mass, sending the assassin crashing into a wall. But there were too many of them. One of them caught him from behind, a brutal strike to his chest plate. His arc reactor sputtered, his vision blurred. This was it. He was going to die here, and part of him thought, maybe that was fair. Steve Rogers was dead, and in Tony's mind, he had never deserved to be the one who survived. But then, a metal arm caught the next strike meant for Tony's head. Tony's eyes widened. Bucky Barnes stood beside him, blocking the blow, shield raised. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Bucky said the words Steve Rogers would have said, "Get up, Stark." Tony's chest tightened. Bucky turned to face the assassins planting his feet. He adjusted the shield on his arm, the star on its surface barely visible in the dim light. Let's finish this. The last Winter Soldiers attacked together. Bucky and Tony fought side by side, the shield and the armor. Bucky moved with calculated fury, blocking, striking, throwing the shield with precision. He fought like Steve had taught him, not just to survive, but to protect. Tony, injured and exhausted, fought with everything he had left. He used his last repulsor charges, every piece of tech, every ounce of willpower. It was messy, brutal, desperate. But together, they won. The last soldier collapsed. The battlefield went silent. Tony, breathing hard, turned to Bucky. There was no hatred in his eyes anymore. "Why did you save me?" Tony asked, voice hoarse. Bucky didn't hesitate. "Because Steve would have." Tony's breath hitched. He looked at the shield in Bucky's hands. It wasn't Steve's anymore. It belonged to Bucky now. And for the first time, Tony didn't resent it. For the first time, he understood. Steve was gone. But his legacy wasn't. And Tony Stark wasn't going to make the same mistakes again. "We're done fighting," he murmured. Bucky gave a small nod. "Yeah." By the time the sun rose over Siberia, it was over. Crossbones was in custody, broken and defeated. The remaining Winter Soldiers were neutralized. And Zemo had been captured by Black Panther. T'Challa had given him one last chance to speak, but in the end, Zemo had no more moves left to play. His war had ended the moment Steve Rogers hit the ground. The Avengers, what was left of them. Higa Sussum stood in the aftermath, staring at the frozen battlefield. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, Tony looked at Bucky. "What are you gonna do now?" Bucky studied the shield in his hands. He turned it over slowly, feeling its weight, feeling the responsibility that came with it. "I don't know," he exhaled, "but I think I have to try." Tony gave a small nod. Steve would have wanted that. Bucky's voice was quiet. "I know." As the Avengers slowly turned to leave, Bucky stayed behind for just a moment longer, staring into the cold Siberian winds. He thought of Steve, of what he had lost, of what he had become, and then, with quiet resolve, he strapped the shield to his arm. Captain America walked forward, not as a soldier, not as a weapon, but as a man who finally chose who he was. And for the first time, Bucky Barnes was free.